Shalom. This week we are reading Parshat Va'era, the second Torah portion in the book of Exodus. And in this Torah portion, we are witness to the beginning of, and in fact the majority, of the 10 plagues that were visited upon Egypt by the God of Israel for the purpose of manifesting his nature, his existence, his reality to the world, and ultimately for bringing his children, the children of Israel, out from Egypt. In the beginning of chapter 7, in this week's Parsha Va'era, we read, Hashem said to Moshe, "See, I have made you a master over Pharaoh, and Aaron, your brother, will be your speaker. You shall speak all that I command you, and Aaron, your brother, shall speak to Pharaoh, that he let the children of Israel out of his land. But I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and I will increase my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. But Pharaoh will not hearken to you, and I will lay my hand upon the Egyptians, and I will take my legions, my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt with great judgments. And the Egyptians shall know that I am Hashem, when I stretch forth my hand over Egypt, and I will take the children of Israel." What do we know about the plagues altogether? The whole concept of the 10 plagues in the Torah is so central to our understanding of Hashem, of our belief in the way he runs the world. The 10 plagues were the very unraveling of the fabric of creation, and through this series of events, God was demonstrating that indeed there are no rules in this world. There are no rules to the way he runs the world. There are no rules to life. He is above nature. That he alone is reality. And the very God of Israel, about whom Pharaoh so arrogantly said, "Who is Hashem, that I should hearken to him? I never heard of him." This was the greatest manifestation of God's existence since the very creation of the world itself. Indeed, the Torah teaches us that the sequence of events of the 10 plagues, together with the whole structure of the Exodus from Egypt, is an event that parallels the creation of the world itself. Thus, small wonder that in the all-important act of Kiddush, the prayers through which we sanctify the Shabbat, we usher in the Sabbath day over a cup of wine, in that prayer we state that Shabbat is a remembrance of the act of creation, but also a memorial to the going out of Egypt, because those events were so seminal in the formation of the timeline of humanity and the understanding of the reality of God, that they were actually parallel events. But we read in these verses that God is telling us in advance that Pharaoh is not going to take heed. He says, "I'll put my hand upon them. I'll take out my legions with great judgments. And then they're going to know, those people in Egypt, that I alone am God." So we also get the feeling from these verses that God is literally playing with Pharaoh, with the people of Egypt, indeed literally playing with the fabric of creation for the sake of making himself known, and ultimately for the sake of taking the children of Israel out of Egypt. And as ever, the Torah comes alive through the riches of the teachings of our sages, the oral tradition. There is so much more going on behind the scenes. And so too, if we'll take one particular plague as an example to uncover some of the depth of what's really happening behind the scenes, and I'd like to talk about the second plague, the plague of frogs that we are going to be reading about in Parshat Va'era. What a scene! What a scene that is! Even when we read the verses, Hashem said to Moshe, "Come to Pharaoh and say to him, 'So said Hashem, let my people go so that they may serve me. And if you refuse to let them go, behold, I will smite all your borders with frogs, and the Nile will swarm with frogs, and they will go up and come into your house, and into your bedroom, and upon your bed, and into the house of your servants, and into your people, and into your ovens, and into your kneading troughs, and into you, and into your people, and into all your servants, the frogs will ascend. Just on the simple level of the verses themselves, this sounds like a scene from the most extravagant Hollywood production. It sounds like it has to be from one of the newfangled animated movies. It sounds like sci-fi, frogs everywhere. And the truth is, when we study the words of our sages regarding what it was really like in Egypt during the plague of frogs, and we know, first of all, that it started with Pharaoh himself, since the verse tells us, in you and in your servants. And so the Midrash teaches us that Pharaoh was pouring himself a glass of water, and even if one drop fell upon him, from that drop sprung forth frogs. Wherever there was water, frogs began to swarm. An Egyptian would be pouring out a cup of water, and it would become full of frogs. An Egyptian woman would be kneading her dough and heating up the oven, and suddenly frogs would come and creep out through the dough and block up the oven. And an Egyptian and a Jew, an Israelite, who would be walking together, frogs would see the Egyptian and would descend upon him, jump upon him, see the Jew, and flee from before him. And there's even an idea that the plague of frogs that the Holy One, blessed be He, brought upon the Egyptians was instrumental in settling a border dispute, because actually there was a kingdom of Cush, the ancient Nubian state, that was centered on the confluences of the Blue Nile, the White Nile, and the river Atbara in what is now the Republic of Sudan, had a border dispute with Egypt. And the Egyptians would say, our border is until this point, and the Cushites would say, no, our border is from this point. But when the frogs came, they were able to make peace, because the exact border of Egypt was overrun with the frogs. So, 6 days after the frogs arrived, they began to take over the bodies of the Egyptians. They entered into their intestines, into their innards, into their inner organs, until the voice of the frogs would be piercing out, croaking through the bellies of the Egyptians. And here again, Pharaoh was attacked first. He would be sitting on his throne, all dignified, laid out in his crown and his royal garments, and all the great men of his kingdom were before him. And the frogs entered into his body, and then into the body of all his servants, and began to croak in his intestines and come out through his mouth. And the frogs within the intestines of Pharaoh would call out. And the frogs within the bodies of all of Pharaoh's servants and ministers would answer. And Pharaoh is sitting on his throne, and Pharaoh's ministers and advisors are standing before him, and the frogs within their bodies are having conversations, croaking and screeching to each other. And in the words of the Midrash, metaphorically, the frog in Pharaoh's intestines would say, when are we leaving? When are we getting out of here? And they would answer, the other frogs, when Moshe comes and prays over us. And this one particular scene, it's almost like the Egyptians are on autopilot, like they became avatars in the sense of the definition that an avatar is a movable image that represents a person in a virtual reality environment or in cyberspace. Pharaoh and his ministers and advisors and the people of Egypt, they became like avatars, because they themselves were not in control. They only represented something else. They were only the hosts to the reality that was in them, which was the frogs. What an incredible scene. So, as Pharaoh began to realize what was going on, and he cried out and sent for Moshe and Aaron to pray for him. And of course, they did that, and the frogs receded. But afterwards, because he had some respite, Pharaoh returned, hardened his heart, decided not to send them. Such is the way of the wicked when they are in trouble, when they are under duress. They cry out, but when they have respite, they return to their evil ways. And the Midrash concludes on the subject of the frogs that all of the plagues which the Holy One, blessed be He, visited upon the Egyptians, He will bring back in the future at the time of the rectification of the world. As the verse states in Isaiah chapter 66 and verse 6, there is a sound of stirring from the city, a sound from the temple, the voice of Hashem dealing retribution to his enemies. And what does this mean? The plague of frogs is going to return? But when we think about this scene, I just can't get it out of my mind. This incredible drama of Pharaoh in his throne room, surrounded by the highest in his kingdom, completely taken over by the frogs within them, crying out, croaking, screeching. They themselves became hosts to something far greater, to a different level of reality, a level of reality which they denied, that was brought home by such a insignificant and lowly creature. In Egypt, the croaking of the frog became the sound of reality. The croaking of the frog became the sound of truth. And so too, as the verse in Isaiah tells us, expounded upon by our sages, in the future also, the voice of truth will come forth, perhaps against our will. The sound of truth, the reality of Hashem, will burst forth from within everyone, even against our will. But that sound, that croaking, in whatever form it takes, will be heard. The sound of the reality of the one true God of Israel.